Okay, so in the past few videos, we have been talking about the cranial cavity, and so far we have talked about the meninges of the brain and the dural folds of the brain. We also spoke briefly about the dural venous sinuses, which are present between the two layers of the dura mater. In this video, let us get into the details of the dural venous sinus. Now, first of all, let us remember that the central nervous system consists of the cerebrum, cerebellum, brainstem, and the spinal cord, which receive a vast amount of blood from the internal carotid and the vertebrobasilar system. However, compared to the other systems of the body, the venous drainage of the CNS is much more complex and does not follow the arteries of the brain. Instead, they drain into the dural sinuses, which subsequently drain into the internal jugular vein. Okay, so what are these dural sinuses? The dural sinuses are venous channels located intracranially between the two layers of the dura mater, the endosteal layer and the meningeal layer. See, in the previous video, we talked about the meninges of the brain. So, the outermost was the dura mater, the middle the arachnoid mater, and the innermost was the pia mater. The dura mater was further subdivided into two layers, which was the outer endosteal layer and the inner meningeal layer. These two layers are firmly adherent at all places except where they split to enclose the dural venous sinuses. Okay, so at all places these two layers are adherent except where they split to enclose the dural venous sinuses. The dural venous sinuses can be conceptualized as trapped epidural veins, and unlike the arteries of the body, they run alone and not parallel to the arteries. These are lined by endothelium and they have no muscular coat and are valveless. Their function is to drain blood from the brain, meninges, orbit, internal ear, and diploe, and ultimately drain into the internal jugular veins in the neck. As so, you can see the superior sagittal sinus, the inferior sagittal sinus, straight sinus, transverse sinus, they're all draining into the internal jugular vein. The second function is to absorb CSF through the arachnoid granulation tissue. So we had also studied in the arachnoid mater that at certain places the arachnoid mater projects into the dural venous sinuses or the dura mater to drain the CSF from the subarachnoid space into the dural venous sinus. So the arachnoid mater projects into the dura mater where it drains the CSF from the subarachnoid space into the dural venous sinus. So the function of the dural venous sinuses is also to absorb CSF through the arachnoid granulation tissue. Another function is that the emissary veins, which are also valvulus, connect the dural venous sinuses with the diploic veins of the skull, which are present between the tables of the skull and with the veins of the scalp. Okay, so the dural venous sinus and the diploic veins are connected by emissary veins, which help maintain the internal and the external venous pressure. Okay, so there are three functions: to drain blood from various parts of the brain, meninges, internal ear, diploe, absorb CSF, and also to maintain the internal and external venous pressure. Now let's come and talk about all the dural venous sinuses that are present in the head and neck. So let's talk about the unpaired sinuses first. I'll give you a brief and then we'll get into each sinus in more detail. So the first sinus is the superior sagittal sinus. It courses along the upper border of the skull. The second is the inferior sagittal sinus. Third is the straight sinus. Fourth is the occipital sinus. And in this picture, you can also see the anterior intercavernous and the posterior intercavernous sinus and the basilar plexus of veins. Okay, so these were the unpaired sinuses. Coming to the paired sinuses, we have the transverse sinus, these two. Okay, so here as well, this is the transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus. And then you have the cavernous sinus, the superior petrosal sinus, the inferior petrosal sinus, and the spinoparietal sinuses. Okay, so now we have a brief idea about all the sinuses that are present in the brain. Fine. Now let's start talking about the superior sagittal sinus. Now, in my previous video on dural folds, I talked about one of the dural folds, which was the falx cerebri. Okay, it began at the crista galli and ran posteriorly to join with the border of the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, so the superior sagittal sinus is found in the upper border of the falx cerebri and begins at the crista galli. It runs posteriorly, grooving the vault of the skull, and deviates to one or the other side, usually the right, at the internal occipital protuberance, where the confluence of sinuses is formed. Okay, so it runs posteriorly, grooving the vault of the skull towards the confluence of sinuses at the internal occipital protuberance, and usually continues as the right transverse sinus. Its tributaries include numerous arachnoid villi and granulations. So, as I told you, the projection of the arachnoid mater into the dural venous sinuses, those are the arachnoid villi. So, or also called the venous lacunae. So, numerous of those project into the dural venous sinus, and they also receive diploic and meningeal veins, and they also receive superior cerebral veins. So, in its course in the sagittal plane, it receives the arachnoid villi or the venous lacunae, superior cerebral vein, emissary, and diploic veins. Okay, and the thrombosis of the superior sagittal sinus may be caused by the spread of infection from the nose or the scalp or diploe, because all of these veins are valveless, right? So the infection can be transmitted through these veins from one area to another. So this is actually one of the most important sinuses, which is why we spoke so much in detail about it. Okay, so remember, this is in the mid-sagittal plane, and it runs along the upper border of the falx cerebri up to the confluence of sinuses, continuing to the mostly to the right transverse sinus. Coming to the inferior sagittal sinus. Okay, so the inferior sagittal sinus is located in the lower free border of the falx cerebri, between the two cerebral hemispheres. It begins anteriorly and ends with its junction with the straight sinus. And along its course, it receives a few cerebral veins from the medial surface of the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so along the lower border of the falx cerebri, we have the inferior sagittal sinus, which continues as the straight sinus. Coming to the straight sinus. So first let's recall the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, so we had seen to the midline of the upper surface of the posterior border of the falx cerebri is attached. Okay, so this is the tentorium cerebelli, which divides the brain into supratentorial and infratentorial notch. Okay, so along this border, along the midline, we see the attachment of the falx cerebri, right? Now along this attachment, we see the straight sinus. So the straight sinus is placed at their line of junction. So the sinus originates with the union of the inferior sagittal sinus and the great cerebral vein, and runs posteriorly in the junction between the falx cerebelli and the tentorium cerebelli to become continuous with one of the transverse sinuses, most commonly the left. So when we were talking about the superior sagittal sinus, we said that it most commonly continues with the right transverse sinus and also gives a little blood to the left one. The straight sinus usually continues with the left transverse sinus. So obviously more blood is drained by the right transverse sinus. So what are the three key points about the straight sinus? It is formed by the union of the inferior sagittal sinus and the great cerebral vein. It runs posteriorly in the junction between the fox cerebelli and the tentorium cerebelli to become continuous with one of the transverse sinuses, most commonly the left. This is not fox cerebelli, it's fox cerebri. Now, so far we have covered three sinuses, which were the major ones: the superior sagittal, the inferior sagittal, and the straight sinus. In the next video, we'll complete all the other sinuses, and I'll link the video in the description. Thank you so much for watching and stay tuned for more. Hope to see you soon.